So we are going to go ahead and get started today. Thanks everyone for joining us for the fifth installment of the 6-week summer faculty lecture series. I am Keenan Williams from the class of 2009, and I serve as president of the Williams Los Angeles Regional Association. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's talk that we're co-hosting along with the Williams NorCal Regional Association. I'm joined here on the virtual stage by NorCal co-president Vladimir Andonov. We're excited to see so many Williams alumni and parents joining us from around the country, in addition to many Eves from California. These one-hour virtual lectures have been scheduled every 3 weeks and have showcased Williams professors from a variety of academic fields. The previous lecture was given by geoscientist Alice Bradley, who spoke about measuring sea ice in a changing climate. You can find listings for a number of upcoming Williams offerings, as well as recordings of past talks at alumni.williams.edu/virtual. The final faculty lecture of the summer series will come from political theorist and chair of Africana Studies, Neil Roberts, who will speak on the topic of living free in an age of pessimism. Keep your eye out for an updated announcement about that talk in the near future. I will now turn it over to Vlad, who will go over the ground rules for today's talk and introduce our speaker for the hour. Vlad.
Hey, thanks, Keenan, and welcome everybody. Very excited to have you all here today. I'm class of 2005, and I'm one of the two co-presidents here in NorCal. My name is Vladimir Andonov. I just wanted to get a couple of ground rules out of the way. So you saw the chat function earlier, sort of introducing each other while we're getting ready. This will be disabled once we formally kick things off with the lecture. However, you see at the bottom, there's a Q&A button. So if you press that, you can enter questions, and it basically creates a queue of questions for Professor Wadsworth to answer either real time or at the end. And please don't feel compelled to wait until the end to write your question. In fact, it might even be easier to get it earlier so he can address it when it's most suitable. That's the only housekeeping I have. Now to the second most exciting part, which is Professor Wadsworth's background before he takes over. So Professor Zachary Wadsworth is an assistant professor of music at Williams, and his musical compositions have premiered at numerous prestigious venues around the world, like the Kennedy Center, Lincoln Center, and Tokyo's Takinagawa Hall. He's a winner of the 2011 international competition chaired by composer and conductor James Macmillan with his anthem, with Professor Wadsworth's anthem, "Out of the South Cometh the Whirlwind," that was performed at no other place but the Westminster's Abbey, at the presence of Queen Elizabeth II. As the 2012-2013 Fellow of the Douglas Moore Foundation for American Opera, Professor Wadsworth was in residence at the Metropolitan Opera and the Santa Fe Opera, Carnegie Hall, and the National Opera Center. In 2020, so just earlier this year, the premiere recording of his oratorio, "When There Is Peace," was nominated for a Juno Award. Finally, I'll just say, in terms of his educational background, Professor Wadsworth earned his doctorate in musical arts from Cornell University, and he has a master's degree from Yale. He's also an honors graduate from the Eastman School of Music and joined the Williams faculty in 2015. So after having previously taught at the Interlochen Center for Arts in the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. Professor Wadsworth, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll take it over. I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Vladimir, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be invited to talk to you all today, and I'm particularly delighted to see so many people here, to see well more than 100 people have joined today's talk. Just to add, there will be some time for questions at the end of the session, so please don't hesitate to type those into the Q&A feature as we go, just to reiterate what Vladimir said. So I will get started here with my lecture by sharing my screen so that you have some slides. Okay, great. So I titled this talk today, "Hearing is Believing," because it can be easy to miss the importance of sound and music in video entertainment. It's far too easy, for example, to think of music as a kind of ornamental afterthought in cinema, But this is incorrect. Music and sound add value to an image by both enhancing its meaning and, even more strongly, by defining it for us. This is not my concept, I should add. The French film theorist Michel Chillon coined the term added value in his 1990 book, Audio Vision, Sound on Screen. And to illustrate quite simply what he meant by added value, the kinds of value that can be added by sound and music, he invited the reader to imagine an image of 3 airplanes. If we see this image with no voiceover, with no sound, we simply see whatever we choose to see. But if we hear an announcer's voice while we see the image, this can force us to interpret the image different ways. For example, if the announcer says, "The middle plane is out ahead," that frames the image as a race. If the announcer instead says, "What gorgeous weather for a day of flying," that then draws the viewer's eye to the blue sky and to the cloud behind the planes. Finally, if the announcer says, "Oh God, what happened to the 4th plane?" this creates anxiety and fear, a sense of drama or tragedy in the viewer. This is a fun exercise, but it relies, of course, on the concretization that comes from speech. How could music interpret such an image? Well, think of the many scenes in film and TV that don't include talking, but nonetheless are meant to communicate meaning. Close-ups are a prime example. The actor's face can communicate emotion, but many contemporary acting styles avoid overt and exaggerated facial contortions. Indeed, much of the most overt facial contortion that we see in acting comes from before sound entered cinema. So where a void is left by an absence of dialogue and overt action, or here, facial gestures, music and cinematography rush in to provide meaning for the viewer. Here's an example from the film Psycho from 1960, directed by Alfred Hitchcock and scored by the great composer Bernard Herrmann. In this scene, the main character in the film, Marion Crane, has just gotten home from work. She has a pile of cash from her work and she is supposed to deposit the money in the bank. But as we'll see and hear, the camera work or cinematography and the music in this scene provide the subtext. Independent of any character, they seem to whisper to Marion, "Go ahead, steal the money, take it, run away with it." Let's watch. There are so many other ways this scene could have been scored. For one extreme example, imagine Shaka Khan's song, "I'm Every Woman," playing behind the scene. It's chronologically impossible, of course, but nonetheless, it would render the scene quite differently for us. Here, as Bernard Herrmann has scored it, the slow-paced unease of his music's long melodic sigh gestures and impatient ostinato figures create a feeling of temptation almost entirely through music. The added value of cinematography or camera movement and music here create a plot point that is never spoken and that's barely acted in the scene. So returning to my title, Hearing is Believing, we see how here Hitchcock and Herrmann add value to their cinematic work through music. They guide the viewer to greater understanding of character and character motivations solely through camera movement and through music. Thus, music helps us to see things that aren't present. And of course, it also helps us to more powerfully see what is present. In other words, it renders an image for us as both actually and emotionally real. For an example of this kind of emotional rendering, let's look at the final scene from the 1977 film Star Wars, which was retroactively retitled Star Wars: A New Hope. This film was directed by George Lucas, and its score was written by John Williams, a composer who has rich connections to Berkshire County in Massachusetts. He was the longtime director of the Boston Pops at Tanglewood. In the final scene from this film, we see a merry band of rebels fresh from victory in battle, celebrating their impossible victory over the Empire. Let's take a look, and more importantly, let's have a listen. This is Hollywood cinematic spectacle at its finest. It is rich and it's romantic, it's soaring, it's emotionally unambiguous, and it's highly memorable. The purpose of this scene is quite clearly to communicate victory and to celebrate it. The rebels won and the empire is vanquished. But how does the scene tell that story? As I'm sure you noticed, it tells the story in two primary ways. First, through visual cues. The giddy interactions of characters, the formal ceremony celebrating their triumph, the painterly final posed shot showing all the film's characters lined in a row, beaming at us. But perhaps even more importantly, it also tells this story of victory through music. Here, John Williams begins the scene with a brass fanfare that could so easily lead into Mendelssohn's Wedding March. I'll show you here at the piano. John Williams does this. And then, in a way, this is a similar fanfare to the one that starts the famous Wedding March by Mendelssohn. And so on and so forth. So Williams begins by channeling this kind of wedding march music and then pivots into a rather more severe sounding trumpet theme that sounds like this. That theme we've heard before in the movie, but it really here is channeling perhaps a similar sound to the sound from Shostakovich Symphony, or a symphony by the Russian composer Dmitri Shostakovich. Finally, we get a kind of third pattern of music that sounds for all the world like Edward Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance March, which if you've ever graduated in a ceremony at a college in the United States, which I suspect many, if not most of you have, you've heard this tune. The original tune is channeled here in a very similar texture and similar effect in Williams's music. It goes, and so on and so forth. We get this kind of walking bass sound, this staccato kind of sound in the bass. Let's see, I will return to screen sharing soon, but you see that what's going on in Williams' score here is that he's channeling a lot of different pre-existing kinds of music and channeling music that many in the audience will have heard before. Now, this lecture is not an interrogation of the originality of John Williams, but it will rather point out that he is acting quite purposefully, not to plagiarize, but rather to channel existing musical associations that people might carry around after a life of watching cartoons, of listening to classical music on the radio, or indeed getting married or graduating from college. When a composer so overtly channels existing musical associations, they are composing music that is called a style topic. Another word for this could be cliché, but the term style topic is certainly less judgmental. Style topics help to render a scene for a viewer because they act as a kind of memory. They reach into the audience's understanding of musical meaning and they channel it to make a scene unmistakably direct. It's worth adding as a side note that this means that style topics make assumptions about the cultural knowledge of their audience. Indeed, they often make rather severe assumptions about the knowledge of their audience. Some examples of other style topics would be, for example, if you are being tied to railroad tracks in a film, particularly in an older film, you might hear music like this. This is a common style topic, and if you are trying to score a movie that has a prominent love story or a love theme, you then are likely to channel a traditional style topic, a prominent swooning melody with a warm, lush accompaniment, something like this. Something like that. These are other examples of style topics in film music. But style topics aren't always used to reinforce cliches. In fact, sometimes they're actively employed to thwart them. Imagine, for example, a scene of children playing ball in a field. Imagine what kinds of musical cliches might be used for such a scene. Well, if we look at an example of such a scene from the film Moonlight from 2016, which was directed by Barry Jenkins, we see a group of boys playing ball here. Jenkins does not engage with any of those imagined cliches that we might have in mind for a normal scene of, as I said, children playing sports. He rather chooses to score the moment in his film with pre-existing sacred music by the classical composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Let's take a look at this scene. Here, the use of a classical music or a piece of classical music as a style topic thwarts the viewer's expectations, instead saying to us, you are seeing a game, but it isn't just a game. You're watching something sacred, something ritualistic, something memorable, something timeless. It's challenging us, in other words, to question our assumptions about the ways that we see, and it's challenging our expectations of how style topics are supposed to work in film. So we see that style topics are at once cliches and expressive tools, and they lean on the weight of musical history and cultural knowledge to communicate to us. But let's return to the throne room scene from Star Wars. Here, John Williams, as I said, is using style topics to scream at us formality, ceremony, celebration, completion, victory, all of these things. And he does it, of course, with skill and panache. The scene is beautifully rendered and emotionally real. I call the scene emotionally real because a simple exercise called masking will reveal that the scene is lacking in realism if we look at it a different way. Masking simply means watching a bit of film without its sound. Only this way can we remove the incredible emotional influence of music and the weight of all of its style topics. Only this way can we actually really see what we're seeing, in other words. Thankfully, for this scene in Star Wars, the YouTube channel, the Aural Knots, has already removed the music from this clip for us. And you'll notice that they added back in the sound effects to render the famous scene with slightly different emotion. Let's take a look. With the absence of John Williams' score, we finally realized that the throne room scene is not really a narrative or plot-oriented ending, but rather it's a kind of musical postlude or coda, providing an unreal send-off to the film. Music itself is the point of the scene, but perhaps what we noticed more than that is simply the humor and the discomfort that emerges when we view the scene silently, because this exposes the deeply strange, almost uncanny quality of the scene. Nobody says a single line aside from Chewbacca's utterances, and yet the crowd performs perfectly coordinated movements. Previously charming nonverbal acknowledgements like smiles and nods now seem completely bizarre, untethered from normal human behavior and pregnant with impossible pauses. Perhaps the strangest thing of all is that the characters almost seem to understand that there is music playing over them. They almost seem to hear it, to be driven by its loftiness and to defer to its crushing volume. This question of whether the characters can in fact hear their own film's score brings me to the next way that film music analysts understand how music functions in a film. We've talked about style topics, but now we have to understand how the music relates to the film's narrative itself. So here, three terms become helpful: diegetic, non-diegetic, and metadiegetic. If music is diegetic, it exists within the diegesis, or the narrative world of a film. To illustrate this, let's just look at an example here. In the 1942 film Casablanca, in this scene, we enter Rick's Café Américain and we hear music. The camera gradually reveals the music's source. The band, led by the character Sam, played here by the actor and musician Dooley Wilson. Let's take a look at this example of diegetic music, that is music within the narrative world of the film.
It had to be you. It had to be you. I wandered around and finally found somebody who could make me be true, could make me be blue, and even be glad just to be sad, thinking of some others I've seen. Might never be me, might never be cross, or try to be bones, but they wouldn't do. For nobody else gave me a thrill, honey, with all your faults. I love you, still have to be you. wonderful you had to be you.
Notice that the music gets louder as the camera gets closer to it. This reinforces the music's physical place within the narrative world of the film. That music, again, is diegetic music because it is audible to the characters in the film. If music is non-diegetic, it exists outside of the narrative world of the film. This is also often called underscoring. We don't assume that characters can hear the music that we, the audience, hear at all times. For an example of non-diegetic music, we can look to the climactic end of King Kong from 1933 for an example here. Let's see here. Yes, in this scene, Max Steiner's swooning score exists firmly outside of the diegesis. It would be hard, after all, to fit an orchestra at the top of the Empire State Building. Let's take a look at this scene from King Kong. So again, this music is non-diegetic because it exists for the purpose of expressing something to us, the viewer, but again, we don't imagine that the characters in the film themselves can hear it. Finally, with meta-diegetic music, we get a kind of middle ground. If music is meta-diegetic, it exists within a single character's mind. A common meta-diegetic sound, for an example, is the tinnitus sound after a bomb explodes next to a character. It is diegetic, meaning it exists within the film's narrative world, but it is subjective to a single character's experience. It's only audible to one character within the diegesis. For a more complex example of meta-diegetic sound, let's watch the beginning of the song Some Enchanted Evening from the 1958 film musical South Pacific. As Rodgers and Hammerstein's song starts, the characters sing in internal monologue, audible only to themselves, and of course to us, the viewing audience.
Wonder how I'd feel living on a hillside, looking on an ocean, beautiful and still.
This is what I need, this is what I've longed for, someone young and smiling, climbing up my hill.
So again here, this music is meta-diegetic because it exists within a single character's experience within the diegesis. At this point, I'd like to remind you that there will be time for the questions at the end of today's session, so please feel free to type those into the Q&A feature as they come to mind, and I'll try to address them at the end. Now, getting back to this, these three terms, often the distinction between these three kinds of film music and film sound is quite clear. But sometimes filmmakers have more fun with these distinctions by blurring the lines between them. This can be hugely expressive. And we see an example of it in Wes Anderson's first feature film from 1996 called Bottle Rocket. This scene takes place immediately after the character Anthony, played by Luke Wilson, has abandoned his love interest Inez, played by Lumi Cavazos. The scene features the song Over and Done With by the Scottish alternative rock duo, The Proclaimers. Let's take a look.
This is a story of our first teacher. Shepherd made the jumpers and the devil made the preachers. Threw up her hands when my mum said her name. And boarded all the stories with slanderous names. But it's over and done with. 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 It's over. It's over.
The song so clearly begins as non-diegetic, and we keep it in that mental space until Inez violently ends the song, ripping it back into the diegesis and exerting her own control over the film's soundtrack. This trajectory from non-diegetic to diegetic is actually more commonly reversed. For an example of music starting as diegetic and then moving into the non-diegetic realm, we only need to look at a film musical. This trajectory is essential to songs and musicals, and when it happens, it's called an audio dissolve. An audio dissolve is the moment where diegetic music is allowed to move into a more fantastical realm. This happens really often in musicals, where a character will be part of the diegesis, maybe start playing the piano and singing, and then at a certain point they might stand up from the piano and an orchestra is playing that we can't see. This is a really common thing, again, in film musicals, and it's called an audio dissolve. It's this moment where we leap outside of the strictures of the diegesis into the non-diegetic, sort of spectacular, fantastical realm. For an example of this, of an audio dissolve, we can look to the film musical Stormy Weather from 1943. This scene begins with the great Lena Horne singing Harold Arlen's song Stormy Weather diegetically. She's very much in the narrative world of the film, singing on stage at a nightclub. Then we see a transition. You'll see she runs to the back of the stage, and we transition into this fantastical non-diegetic realm where the song continues as Danced in the Rain by Katherine Dunham and her dance troupe. Let's take a look at this example of an audio dissolve, or that moment where we leap from diegetic to non-diegetic.
Keeps raining all the time.
But I don't want this to just be a pure lecture with me telling you what's non-diegetic or metadiegetic or an audio dissolve. Now I'd like to put the question to you using a scene from the 2019 film Joker. The film is directed by Todd Phillips and scored by Hildur Guðnadóttir, who won an Oscar for the score. This scene in particular starts with a pre-existing song, the song Rock and Roll by the English glam rock singer Gary Glitter. That music then melts away into Guðnadóttir's score. Let's take a look at the scene. And after we watch it, I'm going to put the question to you whether the Gary Glitter song is diegetic, non-diegetic, or metadiegetic. Let's take a look. Okay, so now I'm going to launch a poll. What do you think? Is the Gary Glitter song at the beginning of this staircase scene from Joker diegetic, non-diegetic, or meta-diegetic, which is to say, can all the characters hear it? Can none of the characters hear it? Or can only the Joker's character hear it? All right, I'm launching the poll now. Feel free to vote as you can. And I see the numbers rolling in. We'll keep it open for a few more seconds. Let's see. Okay, get your votes in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I will now share the results with everyone. We see fairly unanimous, but not completely unanimous, thinking that this is a metadiegetic example. I think that there's actually evidence in a few different directions here. And particularly, I would encourage metadiegetic or non-diegetic as answers to this particular question. Since the police don't seem to hear the music, that might be an argument in favor of both non-diegetic or metadiegetic. But then the entry of Hildur Guðnadóttir's score on top of Gary Glitter's song seems to deepen the confusion of this place. Are there 2 layers of non-diegetic scoring? Does non-diegetic music intrude upon the metadiegetic? And so on and so forth. I think it's a kind of beautifully uncertain example. The space of uncertainty here is expressive. Here, it expresses the Joker's dissociative state and his withdrawal from the society around him. It's not always clear where the music is per se, but its effect on us as a viewer and its message about the character's inner life is quite clear, I think, in the music. So we see that music's position within or outside of a film's narrative can be hugely expressive, but this is only the first of many analytical tools for the film music theorist. Another approach to film music analysis asks how music is related not just to narrative, but to character more specifically. Here we get 2 new terms. I'm just going to keep throwing terms at you: empathetic and anempathetic. Music is empathetic when it responds clearly to a character's specific emotional situation. If a character is in love, we hear love music. If a character is angry, we hear angry music. For an example of empathetic music, we can look to the 2016 film Jackie, which was directed by Pablo Larraín and scored by the composer Mika Levy. In this scene, Jackie Kennedy has just returned to the White House for the first time after her husband was assassinated, and we see her walking through her now empty residence. The music is staggeringly empathetic here. The music starts and then abandons phrases like a person in shock. It itself can't seem to get through a coherent thought. The music cycles through emotions like a person stunned. In one amazing moment, the score's strings slide from one pitch to another, creating a dizzying effect that doubtless empathizes with the character's dizziness. Let's take a look. You might be thinking, isn't all film music empathetic? Isn't that what film music is supposed to be? Well, yes and no. Sometimes filmmakers choose to abandon their characters, refusing to empathize with their situations musically. And in this case, we call the music anempathetic. Many examples of this effect are too violent to show in a large lecture like this. Some examples are in the film American Psycho, when the song Hip to Be Square is playing during a murder scene. or in Quentin Tarantino's film Kill Bill, where the sound of trickling water in a bamboo garden is the only sound accompanying a sword fight scene. But if we return to Hitchcock's Psycho from 1960, we can see a somewhat iconic example of this anempathetic effect, or this effect of sound here, in this case sound, reminding us or refusing to empathize with a character's experience. In the film's most famous scene, its main character, Marion Crane, is murdered in the shower. During the murder, which I won't show, Hermann's score, Bernard Herrmann's score, shrieks with horrifying and violent violin stabbing gestures. It empathizes with the horror of the scene we are seeing and with Marion's terror in her final moments of life. But the moment the murder is over, the music fades with a few low stabs and drones in the string orchestra, and in its place we are left only with the sound of the running shower, an anempathetic and chilling reminder of the world's indifference. So listen for the sound of that shower in this scene just following the stabbings of the murder in Psycho. This effect of anempathetic sound, here the shower refusing to acknowledge the horror of the scene or respond to it, is highly expressive in its own right. It abandons, as I said, abandons a character in a moment of real horror. This is a common effect in horror movies or in slasher films. It won't be much surprise for scenes of violence to be scored with music that does not seem at first glance to make much sense next to that kind of violence. So here we go, let's see. By using style topics and by positioning music with respect to the diegesis and by making decisions about musical empathy, film composers do take sides. In doing so, they encourage or even force us as the audience to do the same. And it isn't just music in film that behaves this way. It's music in TV shows, in YouTube videos, in video games, in Doritos ads, and yes, in political advertising. That's something that we spend a lot of time on in the corresponding class to this topic at Williams College. We look at the way these concepts affect film and different kinds of media across the better part of the last century and a half. So if we learn how to hear what music is doing more critically, we become better critics and better aficionados. And I think it makes us just better consumers of media to be aware of how music is acting on us. So this has been an impossibly brief lecture. We, as I said, spend a whole semester talking about this topic in my film music class at Williams. But I hope it's opened up some new ways of listening to you. And I hope that these terms, or more importantly, these concepts, stick with you when you are approaching your next Netflix series or YouTube clip, just to kind of pay closer attention to what the music is telling you to feel and whether you feel like feeling the things it's telling you to feel. I think it's particularly relevant in a time right leading up to an election to be aware of how media acts on us. So I'd like to open it up to questions now. I have 3 questions already, so please feel free to keep them coming. We have about 10 minutes here to address some questions. And so you can type those into the Q&A area here. I'll start with a question by Beth Fisher. Can you recommend a reference or introductory book that covers the descriptive terms you shared? And yes, I absolutely can. There are certain places online that are good resources, but I would actually recommend, I think it's very readable, the textbook that I use for this class when I teach it at Williams is this book called Hearing the Movies. I didn't write it, so I'm not trying to sell it to you, but I think it's a very good introductory text, and it covers a lot of different periods of film, from the silent film to contemporary-ish cinema, up to movies like Gravity from a few years ago. So I found that to be a really useful resource. I also use for this class a book called Celluloid Symphonies, which is a collection of primary documents, interviews with some of the great film composers, things like lead sheets and suggested music to play during silent films when they were accompanied by pianists and organists live. It's a really interesting resource for primary documents and texts. That's Celluloid Symphonies. I like those 2 books quite a bit and use them to teach in the class. So thanks for that question, Beth. Let's see. I also have a question from Cecilia Kalin. What do you make of Philip Glass's scores? They are moody, but sometimes tedious. Not sure he does diegetic or meta-diegetic at all. Yes, Philip Glass is someone we talk about in my film music class. He's been very active as a film scorer. And his style has really changed over time. With earlier experimental films like Koyaanisqatsi, you get a really severe minimalist score that, as you suggest, is purely non-diegetic, basically, for the whole time. And it's not everyone's cup of tea. I think it's a very different kind of, I don't know if we call it entertainment, documentary, or even a kind of video art, sound art, installation kind of experience. But in some of his later scores, like his score for the film The Hours, I think he softens his approach and starts composing in what one might say to be a more conservative style. But if you haven't seen The Hours, it might cause you to rethink Philip Glass. And if you have and you hate it, then there's nothing I can do to improve your opinion. I think everyone certainly has their different favorite film composers. Let's see. Eunice Nichols asked, can you give an example of a political ad that uses music in a particularly interesting way? This could be its own entire course. There are so many things to say here. There was an ad by the Trump administration during the last presidential electoral cycle that used pre-existing music in a really interesting way. It used the song Over There, which is a First World War song. And it was the message that it was trying to communicate with that song really did bring in the history of that piece of music as a war song. But I would have to kind of sit down and really think for other examples of specific political ads. I'm trying to think of in the iconic ones, but if any come to mind, I'll certainly try to weave those into the class in the future. That's a great question. John Den says, can you speak to the relationship between the director and the person writing the score? It's really different from movie to movie. We talk in the class about Stanley Kubrick as one example of a director who really didn't like working with composers and would almost exclusively assemble his own scores from pre-existing music for that reason. Other people had much more collaborative relationships. Hitchcock and Herman worked together on many films over a few decades and had a very good working relationship. But it really does vary. Often, the most common situation is that the composer gets the very nearly finished film and then tries to compose music to it. There are examples of films that are cut to a score that already exists, but that's a less common arrangement between these people. Let's see. Rocco Cervedio says, can you tell us some of your own favorite film composers? I am a big fan of Bernard Herrmann, whose first movie was Citizen Kane and last movie was Taxi Driver. He had a really incredible multi-decade career and was an incredible composer. On the more contemporary end, I think the work of Bjork and Mika Levy, whose score for Jackie I played, are really quite incredible. They are both doing really amazing work more recently than that. Looking backwards a little from there, there are the Joe Hisaishi scores for the Studio Ghibli animated films. Those are really beautiful. There are, let's see, Max Steiner's scores for films, again, from the 30s, 40s, 50s. Those are really great examples as well, but to each their own. One could also say Henry Mancini's score for Breakfast at Tiffany's. There are lots of great examples in a wide variety of styles. Linda Samuels asks, are there some forms of media and movies where no music is purposefully used as a form of artistic expression? Absolutely. We see this particularly in the French and Italian New Wave, where a lot of filmmakers chose to have no score at all or to have very minimal scoring in order to often present their movies as more realistic, to amplify that sense of verismo in their films. They would often move away from the score, viewing the score as this relic from romanticism and from opera, things like this. I would say it's still statistically much more common for films to have scores, but you do see increasing experimentation starting in the mid-20th century with this idea of leaving out a score entirely. And you also see directors choosing not to score moments of extreme drama, as we saw here in Psycho, once the murder is over. That's a great question. Let's see here. Let's see. Harland Chun asks, can you talk about the style of composer John Barry in non-Bond films? Boy, no. So the challenge with teaching a course like this is that I haven't seen all the movies, and I really only know John Barry's work for the Bond films and then for the movie Dances with Wolves, which is very different, I would say, from a Bond film score, but I haven't seen enough of his non-Bond work to speak to it. He's certainly among film music historians really well regarded as for his Bond work, that all of the kind of brassy swing band kind of sound that he brought into action movies. But I'm sorry that I can't speak more to the rest of that. Let's see here. I think I'll, for my final question today, end with Eunice Nichols. Are there any iconic examples of epic fails in the use of music, and what can we learn from them? This is such a great question. I run into this all the time. I want to teach a class that has great examples, but then realize that I'm probably doing my students a disservice by not showing them terrible examples. And terrible examples are also, of course, matters of taste. I was watching a movie called Kronos, directed by Guillermo del Toro a few weeks ago, and I was struck to me, that seemed like a truly terrible score that really took me out of what was otherwise a really good film. But other examples, for some people, could be so bad they're good. They could fall into the camp category, for example. Here I think of movies like Troll 2, for example. But so I think always, bad things are in the eye of the beholder, just like good things are. But I do think I should probably incorporate it more into my classes to talk about truly bad scores as a learning opportunity. So thank you, Eunice, for that last question. Now I'll turn it over. Thank you all for attending, and I'll turn it over to Vladimir, who will finish up the session.
Yes, thank you, Professor Wadsworth. I never took a class at Williams in music, so I could now say I have taken a small snippet after this, but thank you for the lecture today, and speaking to alumni and to parents and friends of Williams. It's a big family. Thank you for taking time out of your busy early start of the semester. Just a couple of quick notes as we about to break. One is at alumni.williams.edu/virtual. You can see a list of upcoming virtual events. There's a handful, as well as recording of past events, including today's lecture in short order will be available there as well. And then Keenan mentioned at the beginning of the session today that there's one last virtual faculty lecture remaining at the end of the month on Thursday, September 24th. It will be given by the political theorist Neil Roberts, who serves as the chair of the Africana Studies program at Williams. So with that, again, thanks to everybody for joining today, and stay safe and healthy out there. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye. Go Eves.